Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Welcome to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I'm Anna Kate, and I am here today with Jeffrey Bilbro, who is the editor-in-chief of Front Porch Republic and the professor of English at Grove City College. He is also here today to talk about his new book, Words for Conviviality, Media Technologies and Practices of Hope. We are so glad to have you here today, Jeffrey. Thanks so much for being here.
Well, thank you, Anna Kate.
Yeah. So you've written this book. You do a lot of work specifically with media and Christianity and theology and how these all kind of intersect. And in this book, you introduce it by saying, although the printing press and other textual technologies can at times act like an iron pall spreading the gospel of liberty, they just as often spread anarchy and mistrust. So you're kind of introducing us to this idea of how technology, even stemming from as far back as the printing press, has made advancements for the gospel, but in other ways it had made advancements against the gospel or that have kind of taken us steps backwards. And so I wonder if you could talk to us a little bit about what ways that technological advancements of the 1850s and then technical advancements of today have been similarly received.
Yeah, that quote there, the idea of the printing press as an iron pall, comes from The Confidence Man, which is a novel by Herman Melville. And one of his characters in there, they're having this argument about the printing press and related technologies, right? Are they sort of an industrialized version of the apostles magically spreading the gospel and truth? Or, as another one says, is it a sort of cult revolver, where it amplifies, you can shoot more shots, but they're just kind of random and chaotic, and they might kill somebody you're not intending to aim at. And I think that sort of tension between this is the best thing ever, this is going to save us, versus this is just going to sow chaos and make all kinds of problems. We see that again and again with these technologies. So yeah, in the 1840s and 50s, when the telegraph is happening, people have this sort of messianic language about, the first message that gets sent across the Atlantic Ocean is glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill toward men. Because the promise is, now that we can talk to each other across the ocean, we won't have any need to have battles or wars, and we can live in perfect peace. So I think there's always this optimism. You see it again today, if you recall, 10 or 15 years ago with the Arab Spring, and this belief that social media was going to bring democracy to various countries. And of course, just a few years after that, people were thinking, oh, Facebook is going to destroy democracy. And I think we have this sort of bipolar optimism versus pessimism response, both of which see some truth, but end up being, I guess, unbalanced.
Yeah, that's so true. I think you're right that with every new technological advancement, there are things that people are really excited for, hope for that will come. And then there are things that I think people are wary of too. And sometimes even along generational lines as well, that, certain generations are just like, this is the next best thing. And then other generations are like, well, here we go again. And so I think there is kind of that pattern maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, so I wonder if you could talk to us, what are the pitfalls of pure pessimism or pure optimism, and how does what you're offering in this book achieve sort of a middle ground?
Yeah, so I try to do justice to both sides. One of the framing concepts that I use that I think is helpful comes from Ivan Illich in his book, Tools for Conviviality. He has this metaphor about watersheds. He says so often when you introduce and industrialize a particular technology, at first there are rapid, drastic improvements. So, he talks about medicine and kind of modern medicine with germ theory and drugs like penicillin. Rapid improvement in health, like just dramatic. And then that generates so much excitement and optimism that people think, well, let's just go more in this direction and it will inevitably be better. So if a little bit of communication is good, more will be better. It reminds me of sort of C.S. Lewis's story about the Irishman with the two stoves. He gets one stove and finds that it cuts his wood consumption in half, like it heats his house, so much more efficiently. And so he thinks, if I just get a second wood stove, then I can heat my house with no wood. um, and
Mm,
the idea that like we just think more of a good thing is necessarily going to be better. And Illich talks about at some point you reach the point of diminishing and then actually negative returns,
yeah.
and the application of more of this thing is not better. I think we see that with communication, right? Like I'm glad that we can send emails and I can read books, but I also see my students and myself struggling to know what should I listen to and read and think about
Mm,
today when I am just bombarded with so much noise. So,
yeah.
there are downsides of a lack of access to information, but there are also downsides to information abundance. And I think the goal is to recognize the challenges and temptations of our particular context, our particular ecological situation, and
Mm-hmm.
then try to think carefully about how can we prudentially and in that given context push against the negatives and take up the practices we might need to form us in healthy ways, and recognize that it's like the answers will be different in different contexts because the
Mm-hmm.
challenges will be different.
For sure. Yeah. And I think you're right too. For me, even I remember a day and time when my parents would watch the evening news every single night. And I remember that kind of slowly fading off because eventually it's too much information. There's only too much, I think, that emotionally,
Yes,
mentally, psychologically that we can deal with on top
that's
of
right.
the things that are right in front of us. And so I think that's true that there is a healthy balance between the availability and the consumption of information, but at what cost and finding where the limit is for sure. So
Yeah.
that's really helpful
Yeah, and like you say, in a different context, maybe the nightly news is a great thing.
for
If
sure.
you have not, so it's not like information is always bad, but it's just,
Right.
yeah. Nick Carr has a new book that came out just this summer on called Super Bloom, where he kind of talks about some of
Mm,
these dynamics, and I think that's another great analysis of this, where he's trying to parse like, okay, so when does a good thing as it becomes extreme or sort of increases in scale, when it does start having negative effects. So I don't think there are easy answers, but it's at least a conversation that we have to have and be thoughtful about together.
sure. Well, in your book, you kind of split this idea into three sections where you have your utopia, you have your dystopia, and then there's hope at the very end, which I found very helpful, a great way to frame this book. And you start with the utopia section, and each section begins with a question. So, regarding utopia, you ask, what does industrial print tempt optimistic readers to imagine themselves as? And so I want to ask specifically about the metaphor of the men of adamant. So within each section, so section of Utopia, for example, there are five metaphors that are representative of answers to this question. So what does the industrial print tempt optimistic readers to imagine themselves as? So one of these things that they imagine themselves as is the men of adamant. So what is a man or men of adamant? And then how does the mass printing of Bibles, or going back to the Iron Paul idea, how does this affect our communal understanding of Christianity?
Yeah. Yeah. I get this from Nathaniel Hawthorne's short story, The Man of Adamant. And it's a
Hmm.
great little apologue, he calls it, a kind of moral parable about this man, Richard Digby, who is convinced that nobody else in his town is reading the Bible correctly, the way that he's reading it.
Mm,
And so he takes his Bible under his arm, right, that he can now carry with him, his Bible, his axe, and his sword, and marches off into the wilderness and finds this cave where he can live and read the Bible by himself aright. And Hawthorne is very, there's this irony throughout the story that as Digby thinks that he's finally reading the Bible without any false interpreters around him to confuse him, he's actually entering more deeply into the cave and he can't see the words on the page. And so he's actually literally misreading the words. And
mm,
this woman comes at one point and tries to call him out, asks to read the Bible with him and to pray with him. And he just, he refuses, right? He says, "What have you to do with my Bible?" Which is not exactly the
mm.
right response of a preacher.
Sure.
And then, of course, he ends up turned to a man of stone, like his sort of moral hardness of heart becomes literal.
Yeah.
So obviously his posture is wrong, but I think what Hawthorne's pointing out as well is that because the Bible is accessible to him and he feels like he has an accurate copy of the Word of God, then it makes sense that he would want to read it as an individual. And I think we often don't
Mm,
realize fully the sort of interpretive postures that we bring to the text we're reading, depending upon the format we encounter them. So in the same vein, I think it's helpful to recall Thomas Jefferson and his snipping out the parts of the Bible he doesn't like, right? And kind
Yeah.
of creating his own gospels. He can
Mm-hmm.
do that because he has the text that he can just chop up. I think today we see a similar thing with consumer Bibles. Like, this is
Mm,
the Bible for the busy mom. This is the Bible for the busy dad. This is your Enneagram
mm-hmm.
8 Bible. This is your whatever Bible.
Yes.
It's like to you as a targeted consumer individual, rather
Mm,
than like, this is the book of the people of God, meant to be
yeah.
read in the church, for the edification of the body of Christ.
Yeah.
And if you're reading it in a way that is divisive and drawing you away from that community,
Yeah.
that's a problem. So
Yeah.
yeah, I think Hawthorne's really good about the way that the form we encounter the text in actually is conducive to certain dangerous hermeneutics. In this case, kind of excessively individualistic reading.
It reminds me, so I'm in the seminary here at
Right.
Baylor, and I have a friend who we laugh because she was in a theology class and they were learning about the heresies, so Arianism, Gnosticism, etc. And it was funny because when you're like a first year seminarian and you first learn about these, she was like, well, we started reading in the textbook and she was like, oh, yeah, I think that's what I believe. And she was like, and then we would get to class and they would be like, so this is a heresy. And she was like, oh, I didn't realize. And then
Yeah.
the next day they would read another one and she'd be like, oh, this must be the one that we're supposed to believe. And then they were like, this is another heresy. And she was like, oh my gosh, there's more heresies. And I think similarly to what you're saying, there's a way that reading in community, knowing what the history of
Yes.
Christian doctrine and thought
Yes.
has been, it's vitally important.
Yep.
And it really is meant to be read in community. I mean, even going back to the original writing of the text, I think arguably that was in community,
Yep.
And
And
so
they were read
for
out
sure
loud to the church, right?
yes, yeah, exactly. So they're definitely
Yeah.
read in community, experienced by community.
Yes. I think your example there is a good reminder that it's not just the community of those gathered in one time in the building, but also our place in a tradition, right? So that we can learn how to read the Bible
Right.
today by reading alongside Christians who have been reading for centuries. Like, that's a great gift that we neglect at our peril.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think you convey that so well in this section and in the sense of utopia, that there is kind of this hope. Optimistic readers might see it as like, oh, I'm going to have the purest form or just, an unadulterated view of scripture. And really, they don't realize that it can't be understood in that way. And
Yeah.
so I'd like to move on now to the dystopia section, which you frame with the question, what does industrial print lead its victims to fear they will become? So in utopia, you talk about what do they imagine themselves as, but here you talk about is it that they're fearing. And so you quote Michel de Certeau, and he uses the idea of making do. And you use this in reference to Emily Dickinson and her fear that her mind would become commodified. And you talk about that there are ways to make do among the margins of a profit-oriented media ecosystem. So there's a lot to unpack here. So what are ways that we can make do in an increasingly commodified world?
Yeah. It's complicated, right? I mean, I think what's fascinating about Dickinson's poetry is the extreme lengths to which she goes once she becomes convinced that if she were to publish her poems, she would be like inevitably tainted by and complicit in the commodifying nature of the print market in her day. So she has, as a young poet, she mails out some of her poems to various editors and she lets some of them get published. But then she, in part in these correspondence with this newspaper editor I look at, she kind of comes to believe that anytime you're publishing something in a way that's for sale, right, whether the poem is getting sold or the poem is being used to sell advertisement in the newspaper, it's kind of degrading to the soul. And she's trying to communicate something true from her soul to another soul. And the taint of the market, she thinks, is damaging to that. And so she, famously doesn't publish her poems. She will send them in letters to her friends, right? She calls them like little bouquets. Here's a bouquet of poems or a flower of poems I'm giving to you. So she wants them to be gifts, not sold. But obviously, like, this conversation is sponsored by the press. My book is for sale. Anytime you post something online, even if it's free, it's like, are you branding your online I mean, like, if Dickinson is concerned about these dynamics in the print culture of the 19th century, she would be horrified by the way that the online system is just like, is branding is sort of baked into the whole architecture.
Yeah.
So I think we should take Dickinson's warnings seriously, but I also like this idea of making do that Certeau talks about. Like, you can recognize the ways that the system is maybe designed in ways that are not ideal, designed in ways that
Mm.
are negative, and then creatively think, how can I make do along its margins, or how can I use these tools for more redemptive ends? So I talked about Dickinson's her private correspondence. I think there are ways that maybe all of us could take Sabbaths from the screen. There are times,
Mm.
seasons where I am not online for weeks at a time. Or I think about, one of my favorite things to do here at college, obviously, when I'm teaching students, tragically, these beautiful books and ideas that I want to wrestle with my students about are in this like commodified relationship where they're paying money and then I'm making them read books and then they're turning in papers or taking tests. And so they're reading them for a grade. So it's all instrumentalized.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the things I love doing is these book groups that are outside of any grade class context where we're just reading the book, we talk about it, we share a meal together, and it's voluntary. There's no grade.
Mm.
It's just because we love truth and we're friends and we want to learn together. So I think
Yeah.
looking for opportunities like that, like recognizing there are good things you can do even in a broken system, and then there are practices you can take up that allow you to experience words as redemptive and fostering healthy relationships, fostering this mutual pursuit of the truth together.
Mm.
We don't have to despair. We can
Right.
recognize the dangers, but still try to make do and do the good things that we can.
Yeah. For sure. And I think too, some of this even comes out in academia. Just certain studies are funded
Yeah.
by certain people who want certain results. And it
Yes.
does kind of become commodified where your academic integrity can be compromised, the integrity of your research, all these kinds of things, or even for those pursuing doctoral degrees where you need certain outcomes to appease certain people, certain members of your dissertation committee,
Yep.
these kinds of things. And so it really does become commodified. And in the same way, I think, like to what you alluded to in popular culture, even just some of our quote unquote celebrities are just,
Yes.
you know, covered in brands. It really isn't even a person that you're
Right.
looking at anymore, but these brands, the brands they're marketing, and it really is. It's just every post you see on any social media site normally has some kind of paid
Right.
aspect to it. And so it certainly is just this over commodification. And I think you're right that there are these ways we make do and that we find little pockets of joy for the sake of joy or reading for the sake of
Yeah.
reading or research for the sake of research and ways that we can kind of push against the system in
Yeah.
that way. And so I think that's really helpful.
Good. I think you're naming it well. Yeah. That there's just because the system is set up in ways that are kind of steering us towards the instrumentalization or commodification of truth doesn't mean that we have to give up entirely or
Right.
stop pursuing truth together with friends.
Right. For sure. Yes. Well, the last section in your book is about hope, which what a fitting way to end this work. I just think to kind of conclude here is just, it's really impactful. And you ask for this section, what alternative metaphors might orient more convivial reading? And so I just love how you frame it. And some of these seem obvious. So you talk about like conversationalists, keeping the conversation open. You talk about friends, the way we can use friendship, being cross bearers, really, those of us who follow Christ, taking up our cross and following him in all areas of life. But then you also talk about walkers. And this is the very first suggestion you make in this section. And, it kind of gives a little bit of room for more pause. And so I wonder if you would talk to us about conviviality and what it means to walk like a camel. You use this phrase in your
Yeah.
chapter.
Yeah. Thanks, Annika. I like this. I get this from Thoreau, who talks about this in Walden, but especially in his essay "Walking." And his point about camels, he says you should walk like a camel because camels are said to be the only animal or the only beast that ruminates while walking. And there's this long tradition in Christian thought about reading as rumination. There's a kind of digestion, that like an animal that chews its cud, you eat, maybe you read once, but then you have to chew on it repeatedly to extract all the nutrients and to get the meaning out of a text, which of course is very countercultural in an age that's just lots of superficial images or words that you should take in and discard or forget very quickly. So I think part of it is just the slowing down and rumination, something like Psalm 1, where the blessed man delights in the law of God. But part of it too is this idea of walking. And Thoreau is in this interesting tradition, interesting to me anyway, the kind of this solvitur ambulando idea that some problems or some questions are solved by walking, which I think has several different connotations. Part of it is sometimes there's a kind of applied or practical character that's required to answer the question. So you can't simply answer it verbally. You have to answer it
Right.
as you live out. I mean, of course, the fact that Jesus is incarnate, that he comes as a human and he walks with his disciples around Judea, I
Right.
think suggests that some ultimate forms of truth can only be realized in this sort of journey, pilgrimage together. But part of it too, I love about Thoreau. He sort of develops this idea in interesting ways, and one of the aspects of this, I'll just mention one, is he seems to take from walking this idea that you proceed forward by going like left to right. As you walk, you left foot, right foot, left foot, right foot. So in Walden, for instance, and he does this other places too, but in Walden it's very pronounced. He'll sort of say one extreme truth, like solitude is good. We need times of solitude. I need to be alone. And then he'll say, I need community. Really bad.
Mm,
And community is also important. And that's true, right? Like it's not that we
mm-hmm.
just need a kind of medium, like the mean. We need
Mm,
intense solitude and intense community. Or he'll talk about like we need nature, we need wildness, and we need civilization. Yeah. So he's kind of pulling at these extremes. And I think there's something about the idea of going back and forth that helps us recognize the variegated nature of so many realities. That oftentimes truth is multifaceted, and in a day and age that wants us to believe like the battle lines are clear and my tribe is right and your tribe is wrong. Someone like Thoreau that wants to just chew on complicated ideas and see all sides of an issue is really salutary and really important for hoping to use words in the pursuit of truth and healthy relationships rather than, I don't know,
mm.
to win some political or social cause.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. I love this idea of walking the camel rumination, but also walking in terms of action and kind of
Yeah,
letting, like you said, incarnation, the living of life, even just being as
yeah.
part of the experience and how we actually relate words to the world. And so I think you just articulated that so well. So thank you.
Yeah, one of my favorite Wendell Berry novels, one of his characters has this great line. This guy is talking about all these big ideas he's learned at college, and the older farmer says, son, if you want to talk to me, you're going to have to walk with me. And
Mm,
I want to talk to you, but we're going to have to work together, and you're going to have to
right.
show me how these work out, and not just live in your head. And as an academic, I think that's really important to remember.
Yes, for sure. Yeah, I love that.
I'm sure if you do any kind of pastoral work, that's also really important, right? You can have all the right
Yes,
theology, but if it doesn't meet people where they're at today, it's not going to help them.
for sure. Yeah. No, I think you're exactly right. And I think that's where, I mean, even as Christians who maybe aren't necessarily pastors or
Sure.
academics, even just living the way that we talk about Jesus, the way we
Yes.
talk about scripture, Christian life, there is, I think, a level of hypocrisy that happens there when we can't or we refuse to find
Yeah.
that balance. And so there is something to that for sure. Yeah.
Yes.
Well, finally, you have a great epilogue, which kind of summarizes the journey through which you take the reader in this book. But I wonder if you could talk to us about what shape do you hope that this work can take as technology continues to advance, including the introduction of AI. And so you kind of begin with the printing press and you move through different means of technology, means of communication. We've seen just an eruption of AI into the digital space and really into all spaces, all realms are kind of seeing it. And so I wonder if you could talk to us about how your work might continue to shape and grow this conversation as AI continues to be perpetuated.
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I wrote this book during the decade that social media kind of came onto the scene, and then critics of social media were like, these are negative effects. So that was
Right.
really on my mind as I was conceiving it. But then as I was finishing it, the year after ChatGPT sort of hit the world, and
Mm,
so I was so I touch on AI a little bit, but I kind of added that part in at the end. And actually, the current book I'm working on now is all about AI and language. So I'm trying to think about this, continue I guess this train of thought, but apply it more explicitly to
mm,
generative AI. I'll just summarize a couple of thoughts. I think AI, at least generative verbal AI, right? Sort of AI tools used to create words for whatever purpose. It's a view of language as purely instrumental, right? So like these words
mm,
are designed to communicate this info or to get this person to do this thing, whether it's
right.
targeted advertising or what can these words do. And
Right.
certainly words have an instrumental quality, but I
Right.
think as Christians, we hold that words are primarily about relationship, that God's relationship to creation
Mm,
and the verbal creation, the relationship between the creator then and us, our relationship with one another. So that words are not so much about what we can do with them, but how they can hold us in place and hold us in a true posture toward the world, right? Ideally, one that's in line with the creator and redemptive.
right.
And another way to think about this is the ways that artificial intelligence sort of presumes that intelligence is a matter of calculation. Like, let me run some processes on information and spit out like a thing that, again, it's a very instrumentalized notion of intelligence. And
Mm,
obviously, we do stuff with our minds. So this is again an element of human thought, but fundamentally, human thought is about like understanding something truth, right? Like participating
yeah.
in the truth. And of course, the machine can never understand something, right? This is sort of the famous John Searle's famous critique of the Turing test and
Mm,
machine intelligence when he talks about like the Chinese room experiment. That a machine can maybe translate from say Chinese to English, but the machine is not actually understanding the meaning of what it's translating in the
right.
way that a human translator should. And I think we should, we should hold out for the value of human understanding and human
Yeah.
relationships. And yeah, maybe there are things that AI can do for us, certain tasks, or like we can use them in targeted ways. I think there are uses for these tools, but unfortunately, the most profitable kind of business models around generative AI seem to be um, inserting them in between humans and inserting them in between
Mm,
humans and God, right? So that the most uses for AI among young people right now is not to cheat on homework; it's
yeah.
to have companions,
Right.
or this idea of like counseling or pastoral conversations. Like that's
Mm,
I think toxic. And
yeah.
yet those are the most popular uses of these tools. So,
Mm,
um, yeah, I think we need to recover this notion of words as a means of relating and a means of understanding truth, not simply instrumental calculation in the world.
for sure. I think you're right. And I think it's so true that there's just something to human meaning and providing meaning to words. Because even when you think about just etymology,
Yeah.
morphology, I mean, human language, the way we communicate with one another, even nonverbal communication,
Yes.
but it all has this inherent meaning that has been given to it through human connection and through human conversation. And
Yes.
I think you're right that AI kind of strips it of that. And there's something in that maybe they were starting to uncover as early as the printing press, and the idea of an iron pawl, and that we're kind of having to rediscover once again when we
Yeah.
think about AI, generative AI, and the way that it is functioning in our society. So, yeah.
Yeah. But once again, I think we can see the challenges with clear eyes, but also have hope that we can make do and use words redemptively and
Mm,
for community, for relationships, even in contexts that are not ideal or perfect.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for such a lovely conversation and for your faithful scholarship on this book. I hope that our listeners will head to BaylorPress.com to purchase Jeff's new book, Words for Conviviality. And be sure to like, follow, subscribe to our YouTube channel and to wherever you get your podcasts for more from Et al. Thank you so much, Jeff, for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Et al., a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et al.